Welcome to True Crime Case Files, the podcast where we dive deep into the most shocking and chilling crimes across America. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the tragic case of a wife's affair with a felon that turned deadly, ending the life of a quiet and introspective teenager. This is the story of twisted betrayal with a deadly outcome. Max Berners was 15 years old, a quiet high school student living in Linwood, Kansas, a picturesque and affluent suburb of Kansas City. Max wasn't like most kids his age. He struggled with Asperger's, a condition on the autism spectrum that made it difficult for him to connect with others. Max preferred to spend his time alone in his room, playing games like Minecraft and Fortnite, which allowed him to create worlds of his own, far away from the chaos of his real life. Max's home life was far from ideal. His parents, Amy and Dave Berners, were trapped in a marriage that had long grown cold and passionless. Amy, 38, was a stay-at-home mom who had once been known for her warm personality, always smiling at neighbors and attending PTA meetings. But over time the smile faded. She felt stuck in her life, particularly in her sexless marriage. Dave, 41, was a successful business consultant who traveled frequently for work, often to big cities like Chicago or New York. His job kept him away for long periods, leaving Amy feeling neglected and lonely. By the summer of 2018, their marriage was nothing more than a facade. The couple barely spoke, and when they did, it was only about the bare minimum: bills, schedules, and Max. There was no intimacy, no affection. To cope with the emptiness, both Amy and Dave sought comfort elsewhere. Amy began a series of affairs with men and women she met online through sex matchmaking websites. Meanwhile, Dave also had his own secret life, engaging in multiple affairs during his work trips. Neither seemed particularly interested in fixing their broken marriage. The impact on Max was significant. He was already a deeply introverted boy, and the tension between his parents made it worse. Max's teachers at Linwood High School described him as intelligent but distracted. He struggled to focus on his schoolwork and often seemed preoccupied. He became more withdrawn as his parents' relationship deteriorated, spending nearly all his time locked in his room, where Amy sent him while she had wild sex with her lovers. Max rarely spoke about his feelings, but those close to him could tell he was hurting. In the days leading up to his death, Max was more isolated than ever. He retreated into his drawings and video games, seeking solace in his digital worlds. His dream of becoming a graphic designer was likely one of the few things that brought him joy. But tragically, Max would never get the chance to see that dream come true. On the morning of July 25, 2018, Amy Berners made a horrific discovery in her large McMansion in Linwood, Kansas. It was around 9:30 a.m. when she went upstairs to check on her 15-year-old son, Max. Amy knocked on his bedroom door, but there was no answer. She called his name a few times, assuming he was still asleep, but when Max didn't respond, she opened the door to a horrifying sight. Inside, Amy found Max lying on the floor, nearly naked, his body bruised and battered. His own belt, taken from his closet, was wrapped around his neck, and it was clear he had been whipped to death. The scene was brutal, with blood stains on the floor and walls. Max's room, usually cluttered with sketchbooks and video game controllers, now looked like the site of a vicious attack. In shock, Amy screamed and ran downstairs to call 911. Her voice was frantic as she explained to the dispatcher that her son was dead. Within minutes, the Linwood Police Department arrived at the Berners home. When first officer on the scene entered Max's room, she immediately noticed the violent nature of the crime and the eerie silence that hung over the house. Amy was hysterical, pacing in the hallway and sobbing uncontrollably, so much that she slipped on her own tears, almost breaking her leg. Later, she told police she had no idea how this could have happened, insisting that she had been asleep downstairs all night. As more officers arrived, they secured the crime scene, taping off Max's bedroom and collecting evidence. The belt used in the attack, still twisted around Max's body, was taken into evidence. Police also took photographs of the room, including Max's drawings, which were scattered across the floor. Max's father, Dave Berners, was out of town on a business trip in San Francisco at the time of the murder. When police contacted him, he was immediately rushed back to Linwood. In the following hours, the neighborhood was in shock. Parents kept their children inside, and neighbors exchanged nervous glances, Wondering who could have committed such a horrible act in their quiet, affluent suburb, the Leawood Police Department arrived quickly after Amy Berner's 911 call on the morning of July 25, 2018. Detective Diana Blake, known for her professionalism and experience, was the first to enter Max Berner's bedroom. What she found was a brutal scene. 15-year-old Max had been viciously whipped to death with his own belt, which was still wrapped tightly around his neck. Blood spattered the floor and walls, and the room looked like a sight of pure rage. Max, merely naked, lay lifeless on the floor. As other officers joined Blake, they carefully examined the scene. It was immediately clear that this was no random attack. The use of Max's belt suggested that the killer was someone who knew him well. The room itself, usually filled with video games like Minecraft and drawings, was now a crime scene. Max's sketchbooks lay scattered across the floor, some covered in blood. His gaming console, still plugged into the TV, was undisturbed, making it unlikely that a robbery had occurred. Lead investigator, Detective Dennis Halpern, arrived shortly after Blake. Halpern, a methodical investigator with 20 years of experience, carefully surveyed the room. He noted the intensity of the violence, particularly the multiple lashes on Max's body, which indicated prolonged suffering. The position of Max's body and the belt around his neck suggested that the killer may have tried to strangle him before finishing the attack. Police took several key steps to gather evidence. They dusted the belt and door handles for fingerprints and collected blood samples from the floor and walls. Crime scene technicians used luminol to detect any additional blood traces, and forensic teams bagged and tagged Max's personal items for further examination. Blake and Halpern also ordered a full autopsy to determine the exact cause and time of death. Meanwhile, Amy Berners, still in shock and nursing her sprained leg, was questioned briefly by the police. She claimed she had been asleep downstairs when the murder happened, completely unaware of the violent attack unfolding in her own home. While Amy's distress seemed genuine, investigators couldn't ignore that she was the only other person in the house at the time of Max's death. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this case wouldn't be solved easily. The violent nature of the crime and the fact that no obvious suspect emerged right away left the Leawood police with more questions than answers. Amy Berners, 38, was the first person police turned to in their investigation of Max's murder. As Max's mother, she had been home at the time of the crime, and her initial shock and distress did not erase the fact that she was the most obvious suspect. In the years leading up to the murder, Amy had grown deeply unhappy in her marriage to Dave Berners. Once a vibrant, outgoing woman, Amy had become bitter and resentful as her relationship with Dave turned cold and sexless. Dave's frequent business trips and emotional detachment left Amy feeling abandoned. She longed for attention and sexual pleasure, but found none at home. Instead of confronting her feelings directly, Amy began to lash out at those around her. She would flaunt her sexual attractiveness, often wearing revealing outfits, by Midwestern standards, and acting flirtatiously, even walking around naked in public settings. Her neighbors in Leawood, a quiet suburban community, began to notice her increasingly bold behavior. Rumors swirled that Amy was seeking sexual validation in ways that made others uncomfortable, but no one knew the full extent of her actions. Behind the scenes, Amy, a self-described very sexual person, had started searching for sex in the arms of others. She turned to online sex matchmaking websites, using platforms like Adult Friend Finder and Tinder to meet men and women who could offer her the experimental, anonymous sex she craved. Over time, she engaged in a series of sexual affairs, some short-lived and casual, while others became more serious. Amy became increasingly reckless, meeting strangers in hotels, parking lots, and even in her own home, locking Max in his room so he couldn't bother her or her lovers. These secret relationships gave Amy a sense of power and control that she didn't have in her marriage. When police questioned Amy, she was initially cooperative but deeply emotional. She claimed that she had no idea who could have done this to Max, and insisted that she had been asleep downstairs with a bottle of antidepressants and a glass of red wine when the murder took place. Despite her grief, investigators couldn't ignore her past. Amy's string of practically anonymous sexual partners raised suspicions. Amy denied any involvement in Max's death, but her erratic behavior and hidden lifestyle made police question whether she was telling the whole truth. As the investigation continued, Amy's bitterness and secret life would become central to understanding what had happened on the night of Max's murder. Dave Berners, 41, was the next person police turned to. As Max's father and Amy's estranged husband, Dave's role in the family's troubled dynamics became an immediate focus of the investigation. A successful business consultant, Dave spent much of his time traveling for work, often gone for weeks at a time. His career had taken priority over his family, and it showed in his distant, authoritative relationship with Max. Despite his absences, Dave still tried to exert control over the household, keeping a strict demeanor that did little to hide his growing disinterest in both his marriage and his son. In the months leading up to Max's death, Dave and Amy's marriage had deteriorated completely. While Amy sought validation through anonymous sex with dozens of strangers, Dave had his own secret life. Though not as openly reckless as Amy, Dave had maintained multiple affairs during his work trips, meeting women for sex in different cities, some through business connections and others through dating apps like Tinder and Ashley Madison. To the outside world, Dave was a respected professional, but behind the scenes he was as disconnected from his family as Amy. Police questioned Dave thoroughly, starting with his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Dave claimed he was on a business trip in San Francisco, staying at a Marriott hotel, and provided receipts and flight information to back up his alibi. Despite his ability to account for his time, police couldn't rule him out entirely. Dave's cold relationship with Max raised questions about whether his emotional distance had played a role in Max's troubled life, and, ultimately, his murder. Investigators wondered if Dave's detachment, or perhaps even resentment, could have led him to hire someone to kill Max. During his interrogation, Dave remained calm, though he was clearly shaken by the news of his son's death. He denied any involvement, but his lack of emotional connection to Max didn't go unnoticed. Police probed deeper, asking about his relationship with Amy, and whether he knew about her affairs. Dave admitted that he was aware of her infidelity, but claimed that it didn't bother him. He had long since stopped caring about their marriage. His cold, matter-of-fact responses left detectives suspicious, but with no hard evidence tying him to the crime. Though Dave's alibi appeared solid, investigators kept him under scrutiny, suspecting that his emotional detachment from both Amy and Max might have led to deeper, darker motivations. It was a scorching July afternoon in Lilwood, Kansas, when investigators uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that changed the course of the case. Just after 2 p.m. on July 20, 2018, Detective Blake, one of the lead investigators, received a tip from a neighbor about suspicious activity at the Berners' home the night Max was murdered. The tip pointed to Amy Berners not being alone in the house at the time, as she had previously claimed. The tipster reported seeing a man sneaking into the house late that night, someone they didn't recognize from the neighborhood. Armed with this new information, detectives immediately focused on reviewing surveillance footage from nearby homes. After hours of combing through grainy footage from a doorbell camera, they finally spotted something significant. A shadowy figure entering the Berners' home around 10:30 p.m. on the night of Max's murder. The figure was identified as Jack Calloway, a known felon with a violent history. Jack Calloway, 45, had a criminal record that included domestic violence, assault, and various other charges. He had served time in prison and was well known to local law enforcement. As soon as police learned that Jack had been in the house during the time of the murder, the focus of the investigation shifted. Detectives immediately confronted Amy with the new evidence. Under pressure, she admitted that Jack was her sex partner and had been at the house that night, but she insisted he had nothing to do with Max's death. According to Amy, Jack had been with her downstairs while Max was in his room, locked away, as was often the case. The revelation shocked the police. Jack's sexual relationship with Amy had flown under the radar until this point, as Amy had carefully hidden her involvement with Jack, even from her closest friends and other sex partners. She had met Jack on a sex matchmaking website and was drawn to his rough, controlling nature, qualities that, for reasons unclear to investigators at the time, seemed to appeal to her. This revelation was a turning point in the investigation. Jack Calloway's violent past, combined with his secret presence in the house, raised serious concerns. Investigators began digging deeper into Jack's history, finding that he had a pattern of escalating violence when he felt his control slipping. The fact that Max had been murdered in such a brutal and personal way, whipped to death with his own belt, made it clear to police that whoever killed him had acted out of rage. The investigation now had a new prime suspect. Jack Calloway, Amy Berners' secret lover, had a history of violent behavior that quickly made him the primary suspect in Max's murder. Jack, 45, was no stranger to law enforcement. He had spent significant time in prison for assault and domestic violence, with a long record of brutality against his past partners and their children. Many of Jack's former wives and girlfriends have been severely injured, some even maimed for life. One woman, his second wife from Raytown, lost an eye after Jack punched her during an argument. Another woman from when he was in Denver, the mother of 2 young children, had been beaten so badly by Jack that her son was left unable to walk due to spinal injuries. Jack's abusive patterns weren't just physical, he was deeply manipulative. He used control tactics to dominate the women in his life, convincing them they needed him. With Amy, Jack promised her endless sex, drawing her into a toxic relationship that fed off of her own insecurities. For Amy, who felt trapped in a loveless, sexless marriage with Dave Berners, Jack's promises of passion and excitement were irresistible. Jack's manipulative grip over Amy was strong, and she became fully dependent on him. Ignoring all the warning signs of his violent tendencies, even locked her son in his room so she could enjoy nights of uninterrupted sexual passion. In late July 2018, police interrogated Jack about his whereabouts on the night of Max's murder. Jack initially denied any involvement, claiming he was nowhere near Linwood. However, when presented with surveillance footage of him entering the Berners' home, his story shifted. Jack then admitted to being in the house that night, but insisted he had nothing to do with Max's death. According to Jack, he had been downstairs with Amy the entire time, engaging in what he called a hot, lusty beliefs, while Max was locked in his room, out of sight, out of mind, unable to bother them, even by going to the bathroom. Despite his claims of innocence, investigators remained suspicious. Jack's violent past painted a chilling picture. He had a pattern of lashing out when he felt his control slipping, often taking out his frustrations on those around him. His victims had learned the hard way that crossing Jack could lead to devastating consequences. As police dug deeper, they discovered that Jack had exhibited signs of jealousy toward Max, viewing the boy as an obstacle in his relationship with Amy. Jack saw Max as a nuisance, someone who got in the way of his control over Amy. With a clear motive in his violent history, Jack Calloway became the prime suspect in Max's murder. Investigators were certain that Jack's violent tendencies had re-emerged, and this time Max had been the unfortunate target. On August 3, 2018, just over a week after Max Berners' murder, police finally gathered enough evidence to arrest Jack Calloway. Investigators had pieced together a timeline that placed Jack at the Berners' home during the time of the murder. The turning point came when a neighbor's security camera captured Jack entering the house late on the night of July 26. He had slipped in through the back door while Amy distracted her son, locking Max in his room to keep him out of the way so he couldn't bother while she was having sex. Investigators believed that Jack grew increasingly jealous of Max. To Jack, the boy represented the last thread tying Amy to her old life, a life Jack desperately wanted her to leave behind. His violent history of manipulating and abusing women, along with the resentment he felt toward Max, provided a clear motive. That night, fueled by rage and a need for control, Jack stormed upstairs and entered Max's room. The boy was defenseless. Jack grabbed Max's own belt from the closet and, in a fit of rage, brutally whipped him to death. When police arrived at Jack's apartment in Kansas City to make the arrest, it was 7:30 a.m. on a humid summer morning. Jack answered the door calmly, completely unaware that his violent secret had been uncovered. The officers immediately handcuffed him and read him his rights. Jack violently maintained his innocence, cursing at the officers and insisting that he had no involvement in Max's death. However, his composure cracked when he was shown the surveillance footage and presented with the evidence of his prior violence toward women and children. For the first time, Jack appeared visibly shaken, but he still denied everything. Amy Berners was also present during the arrest. She had known for days that the investigation was closing in on Jack, but she had tried to convince herself that he wasn't capable of killing her son. When Jack was taken away in handcuffs, Amy broke down in tears and peed herself. She realized she had been manipulated by a man who had destroyed everything she had left. Max's father, Dave Berners, who had been largely absent during the investigation, was notified of the arrest later that morning. His reaction was cold and distant, seemingly more focused on the legal proceedings ahead than on the tragedy of his son's death. Max's teachers and classmates, who had held a vigil for him earlier that week, expressed relief that an arrest had been made, but they remained devastated by the senselessness of the crime. Jack Calloway was charged with first-degree murder, and the case against him was about to begin. Jack Calloway's trial began on January 4, 2010, in Leawood, Kansas, just months after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with family, friends, and community members, all hoping to find justice for Max Berners. The lead prosecutor, Mark Jennings, a 45-year-old attorney known for his tough approach in the courtroom, presented a strong case against Jack. Jennings argued that Jack's history of violence, coupled with the surveillance footage and witness statements, painted a clear picture of guilt. He told the jury that Jack's jealousy and rage had driven him to commit a horrific act against a defenseless boy. On the defense side, attorney Linda Green, 38, aimed to challenge the prosecution's narrative. She argued that Jack's violent past did not mean he was guilty of killing Max. Green attempted to introduce reasonable doubt by suggesting that Max's death could have been an accident, or that someone else could have been involved. However, many in the courtroom found her arguments weak, especially considering the overwhelming evidence against Jack. The emotional weight of the trial was palpable. Max's family sat in the front row, their eyes often filled with tears. His mother, Amy, who had once played a role in her son's tragedy, was now seen as a victim of Jack's manipulation. As the prosecution laid out the details of Max's murder, Amy struggled to hold back her emotions. Friends and teachers of Max spoke about his bright future and how he had dreams of being an artist or a game designer. Each testimony reinforced the profound loss felt by the community. After 5 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating on January 18. They returned with a verdict the next day. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as the jury foreman stood to read their decision. We find the defendant, Jack Calloway, guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by tears of relief from Max's family. On February 2, 2020, in a shocking move, Jack was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. The judge emphasized the need to protect society from Jack's violent tendencies. Many felt the sentence was not just, given Jack's history and the brutal nature of the crime. Max's friends and family left the courtroom with mixed emotions, relieved that justice had been served but still grieving the loss of a young life full of potential. After Jack Calloway was sentenced, the lives of those connected to the case changed dramatically. Amy Berners, Max's mother, found herself at the center of controversy. In the wake of the trial, she faced intense scrutiny from the community and the media. Some residents of Leawood, Kansas, were outraged by her role in the events leading to her son's death. They wondered how she could allow a violent felon like Jack into their home. As a result, Amy lost many friends and support in her neighborhood. Desperate to escape the harsh judgment, Amy moved to a nearby town, hoping to start over. She sought therapy to cope with her guilt and the loss of her son. In therapy, Amy learned to confront her past decisions and their consequences. Despite her efforts, she struggled to find peace. The pain of losing Max lingered, and she often felt overwhelmed by grief. Occasionally, she would participate in community events aimed at raising awareness about domestic violence, trying to turn her tragedy into a lesson for others. However, her efforts to rebuild her life were often overshadowed by her past. Dave Berners, Max's father, faced his own challenges. The trial revealed his infidelities and neglect towards Max, leading to a strained relationship with his family. Feeling lost and without purpose, Dave sought work in a different city, hoping to leave his past behind. He started working as a business consultant, but the job was not fulfilling. Despite his career success, he could not escape the guilt of not being there for Max. Friends and family continued to express concern about his mental health, and he often found himself reflecting on the moments he missed with his son. Meanwhile, Jack Calloway served his sentence at the Lansing Correctional Facility. The violent felon struggled to adapt to prison life, facing challenges from other inmates due to his reputation. He often boasted about his manipulative skills but faced harsh realities in a place where power dynamics were constantly shifting. Jack's past actions caught up with him, as inmates viewed him with suspicion and disdain. In interviews with local media, corrections officers reported that Jack continued to deny responsibility for Max's death, refusing to take accountability. In the years following the trial, the community of Leawood began to heal. Max's friends established a scholarship in his name, supporting students pursuing careers in the arts. They hoped to honor Max's memory while advocating for the importance of mental health awareness and support for troubled families. This has been True Crime Case Files. Join us next time as we uncover another dark and twisted tale. Until then, stay safe.